Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio, where our mission is to provide education, entertainment, hope, and inspiration. USA Global TV and Radio connects you with experts and audiences all around the world every single day to help you succeed in business and to live a richer life. Visit us at usaglobaltv.com to learn about career and life-changing training and mentoring programs like the Listening Mentor. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our special programs and offers. Discover how you can become a guest on one of our shows or a host or producer of a USA Global TV and Radio show of your very own. That's USA Global TV and Radio, where the doctor is always in.
Hello and welcome to USA Global TV and Radio. My name is Caroline Heward and I'm known as the Harley Street Stress Expert. I'm also a TV host on USA Global TV and Radio, and also I'm the resident therapist for the channel. Our show today is Talking Heads, and I'm an expert presenter in today's topic, which is part of the Mind and Body Connection series. Our topic today is the cycle of violence, intergenerational trauma in conflict zones. So let's begin. I did a little research on this topic just to find out what was meant in terms of dictionary versions of the understanding of intergenerational trauma, to make sure that I was in alignment with what is actually being written about it. And it says intergenerational trauma is also called historical trauma. It's also called multi-generational trauma, and it's also called secondary traumatization. So I wasn't too far away, but the secondary traumatization was a new word for me. And I do like to look and find out what the general consensus is on the subjects that I'm looking at. Here's a simple definition of intergenerational trauma. If you have ancestors or older relatives who went through a distressing or oppressive time or event, also if you exhibit emotional and behavioural reactions, it's a ripple effect through the generations of the family. It not only affects you, the person who has been subject to the trauma, it also affects the other generations, the children and the other people around you, and they will have what's called intergenerational trauma. So what is intergenerational trauma, and how is it caused by war? There's been widely studied the Holocaust. And just before the show, I was talking to the wonderful producer, Heather, and she was and I was sharing with her about the fact that being in the UK, particularly, and in Europe, that we have been very mindful, and the trauma of the Second World War is very evident in Europe. And there's been wide studies of the Holocaust and children of the Holocaust and survivors. And it is a well-known study and fact that the children and survivors of the Holocaust suffer intergenerational trauma, not only the survivors, but their children as well. And this is what intergenerational trauma is in terms of war, the trauma caused by war. It's also called it's also transgenerational trauma, and that is because it goes through the various generations. It might be the grandchildren may be affected by a Holocaust survivor because they will have lived through the trauma of the parent and then the parent parenting the child. So the effects are wide, and the effects are passed down through the family lineage. It affects those who have suffered the trauma and also the subsequent generations thereafter. And certainly in this weekend that's just happened, it was our Remembrance Sunday, that's remembered using the poppy, and we had Memorial Day on Monday, Remembrance Day, in terms of looking at the fallen, remembering our fallen soldiers, remembering the ones that went to war to fight for our freedom. And there are children that are still survivors of that war, and there are grandchildren and subsequent generations that have had experiences of being parented or survived from the adults of their generational family lineage. So that'd be grandparents, parents, people that have been to war, and people that have been brought up by the parents and peers of people that were in war-torn territory and war zones. I'd like to share some examples of probably much more current times. I see a lot of people that have trauma, and I've had a lot of people that I've seen from South Africa. And in South Africa, there is both white South Africans as well as black South Africans. And I had a client that was white South African, and he was 71. He was born and brought up in South Africa, and he was there till he was 50. And he was in the London, UK for 21 years. And yet he said he didn't sleep. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't know how to switch off. And he said that that's just the way life is. And when I explored a little bit further with this person, because at first I didn't realize that he'd spent so many years in South Africa, and even though he'd spent over 2 decades in the UK, the trauma was still there because he'd never looked at resolving the trauma. And so even though he wasn't in the trauma zone, and South Africa isn't in the times of civil unrest and troubles, he still was suffering the trauma. So it hadn't gone away. Also in the Europe and in the UK, Northern Ireland is known for its troubles. And certainly when I was young, there was the troubles in the 70s. And I grew up knowing about different bombs that were going off, and people, families that were nothing to do with the war zone, but caught in the crossfire. Lots of children were caught in the crossfire, and many people lost their lives. And they didn't like it to be known as a war. It was known as the Troubles of Northern Ireland. And the fact that it's still there, it's still underneath the environment and the generations, even though there may be young children now that weren't born in the Troubles, they have ancestry generations that were in the Troubles and have been scarred and traumatized by the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And when I first left school back in 1980, I went to an all-girls school, and our schools were very close to the boys' school, and a lot of our boys went to the Falklands War. It was so traumatic for our boys that went to the Falklands War, because they were called up, and like good British soldiers, good British boys, they went to war. And they didn't come back the same. So even in my time as a young adult, I have seen the trauma that can take effect on young people. So I'm not just talking about troubles and war affecting our Second World War way back in the 1940s. I'm looking at current day times. And our current day times, in looking at current day time wars, we have Russia and Ukraine, again in Europe. Even though this might not be worldwide, in Europe it's very troubled, and there is a lot of unrest and trauma in terms of the intergenerational trauma that is happening because of the Russian and Ukraine war. Children that are survivors of this war that's going on right now will suffer intergenerational war trauma. And that is because they've had to cope and survive. They didn't know whether they're going to make the day, whether they're going to survive the day, the week, the month. They're living from moment to moment. So I believe that there will be a generation of traumatized survivors and children from the current war that's taking place in Russia and Ukraine. And so if this isn't about something that's happened so long ago that the people are much older and they're aging out and dying. This is in our current times. The trauma of war, intergenerational, will affect our children, our parents, and their children, and their children's children. So how can intergenerational trauma be seen in society today? Well, at the root of the trauma, there will be concerns, and there will be angst against women. There will be at the root of the trauma anger. It may affect minorities who are different, people that are not belonging to the country that they're residing in, refugees, for example, people that have been displaced by war, people that are not in their home country and have had to give up all of their life, have had to give up their belongings, their family, people that have lost family. And in that displacement, there is a lot of trauma because they have survived and they have thrived. And at the same time, they've had to create new lives in a new country with new people and a different culture. But anger will lie at the base of this trauma. Anger at the fact that they were traumatized by something that they didn't have any control over or indeed responsibility. So a person may be hyper-vigilant, a survivor. They may be very fearful. They may have a fear of death. They may have or experience or talk of no hope for the future. They may have a mistrust of outsiders. They may have panic attacks. They may suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. And they may be at the end of domestic abuse, domestic violence, or sexual abuse, or they may become the abuser. And it's coming from a place of anger and displacement. It's not coming from a place of control. It's coming from unexpressed and undealt with trauma. And when you see somebody displaying some of these characteristics, some of these behaviours, there will be a trauma behind all of it. It might not be a war trauma, but there will be a trauma from childhood that will be behind their external behaviours. So, like generations before them, children may live with a heightened level of anxiety. They may be very fearful, and so anxiety resides in the mind. It's when the mind is constantly focused, what next, what next? If I do this, if I don't do that, if I do this, then that might happen. And if I don't look at this, or if I don't look at that, this will have to be dealt with. And it's focused on the future tense of things that have not happened, or even more to the point, may not have happened and might not happen at all. But it's the level of conversation, the analytical conversation that resides in the mind. It's not real. The fact that they're in the mind is a result of the trauma that they have experienced, either personally or intergenerationally. The trauma that they have experienced will be passed down from the different generations. They may suffer from serious bouts of depression, and they may have difficulty connecting to people, with others. I want to explore the connection with other people, because I've had a lot of clients that find it difficult to connect, and so they're very much driven in terms of their work, and they put all of their energy in their work and what they do. So they become very much doing people rather than being people. What I mean by that is it's about the detail, the flux and the flex of their diary, that the diary is full of activity, of appointments, of things to do. And this is a way of avoiding the trauma, a way of keeping oneself busy, keeping yourself occupied. The challenge is that when you go to bed at night, the problem is that there's no distraction and that the mind keeps going. So let me give you a little bit more of an understanding of why the mind is busy. When there is a trauma, whether it's been personally experienced or generationally experienced, intergenerational trauma, the mind will be very active. And when the mind is very active, there will be a disconnect with the sensory experiences of the body. When you're born with your five sensories: what you see, hear, smell, taste, feel. And the feel is not sadness, loneliness, heartache. The feel is, how does the wind feel in my hair? How does the sun feel on my face? How does the water feel on my back in the shower? It's sensory feel. And if you've forgotten what that looks like or experiences like, look at a new baby. They are in their sensory experience. There is no mind, there is no conversation, there's no analytical debate. They are completely sensory. And when there is trauma, whether you've experienced it firsthand or intergenerational trauma, there will be a shutdown of the feelings and emotions. Now, the feelings and emotions reside in the belly, below the belly button. And when you shut down the feelings and the emotions, the escape route is the mind. And so then you will talk, converse, analyze, and think your way through your experiences and through life. And it might feel that everybody does that. I have many clients that say to me, well, isn't that normal? Doesn't everybody do that? I answer very gently, slowly, no, they don't. And you weren't born like that either. You were born sensory. And it's the fact that the body is a perfect self-defense mechanism. And what it does, it protects you. Even if you are 2 years old and something has happened, you've been in an environment where there's been war, even if you don't understand or there's been conflict, the trauma of that, even though you don't understand, the body will naturally shut down the feelings and emotions to protect you. It's not something you decide, it's not something you think about. The body naturally protects you. Even if you're 1 year old, the body will protect you. And then you live life with the emotions and feelings shut down, and the escape route is the mind. And so then you think, talk, and analyze, and it becomes your norm. This is how life is. But relationships will be difficult because connection is difficult, because you will feel a disconnection with yourself. And if you are disconnected to self, it'll be very difficult for you to connect with others at the same place. You will meet them where you are in the same space. And others will feel challenged by the fact that it's difficult to connect with you. And you will feel the challenges and maybe get feedback from people, from your family or people that you are in relationships with. There is also a problem of regulating feelings. Sometimes you might feel an overwhelm, and sometimes there may be a numbness, a sort of a not feeling anything. So something might happen, like a bereavement, and there will be a complete numbing down of the experience. No tears, no expression of grief, just a feeling of nothing. Shock, silence, and numbness, a no feel. And this is another way that the body protects itself from being hurt, to protect you so you don't feel. Now, the emotions and feelings reside in the belly, below the belly button, and that's also where the sexual energy resides as well. And I'm going to be looking at how the sexual energy is affected. It can negatively affect when you are not regulating your feelings and emotions. It can negatively affect the parent and their own children and their children in terms of the behaviours coming down through the generations. So war is not the only cause of intergenerational trauma. Racism can be an effect and a root cause. Domestic violence, sexual abuse, other forms of abuse, and generational trauma. Also, the style of the parent's attachment or detachment of how they express and how they behave around their children, how they behave when they're depressed, how they isolate themselves. Also, when they don't want to talk about the horrific things that happen to them, and at the same time, not wanting to share the experiences of their horror and feeling it needs to be kept secret. And it comes out, whatever you suppress will be expressed in the energy of the environment that you're in. And the children will pick it up and start dealing with your unexpressed trauma. Let me say that again. The children will start dealing with your unexpressed trauma. So if you push it down and do your best to hide the feelings, the emotions, the sharing of your experiences, if you were indeed traumatized firsthand by war or from an intergenerational experience of trauma, you will express in a different way, and the children, grandchildren will pick it up and will start to work through the unexpressed and undealt with trauma that you didn't deal with. It's interesting how this works, because you think, especially if you are first generation or traumatized, how you are protecting, and you will think that this is protecting your family. But when things are not spoken about And when things are not aired and feelings and emotions aren't expressed, the suppression of those feelings and emotions have an effect not only for you, physically, emotionally, mentally, for the generations and the children and their children around you. So it comes through the family, and also your detached style will then transfer to the parents and the children of the intergenerational trauma. So the children may struggle to self-soothe. They may struggle with mental health issues. They may struggle with anxiety and depression. They may experience low self-esteem, and they may even be a risk to suicide or self-harming. And this is because they are experiencing intergenerational trauma. So the consequences are above and beyond mental health issues. It can infer self-destructive behaviour, and the tendencies towards violence or aggression will be rife in intergenerational trauma. Let's look a little bit deeply about how it affects the health, how trauma can impact your physical health. It is associated with a higher risk of heart disease. Now, I want to explore this a little bit more so that there is an understanding for you and for your family of why heart disease can be a higher risk. Now, the heart is related to air. The element that's associated with the heart is air. And when there is unexpressed grief, the saboteur of the heart chakra, which also is where the thymus gland resides, when the heart chakra shuts down because of grief, because that is the saboteur, it will cause difficulties with the heart in its functionality. Now, air is the element of the heart chakra, and when it shuts down for protection, it will give you things like hypertension, high blood pressure, also things such as lung and heart problems. Now, this can be all associated with undealt with and unexpressed grief, unexpressed loss. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you were the person that was affected in the conflict of war. This is about the children and the children's children, the parents, the aunts and uncles, the siblings, the ones that didn't go to war but have been suffering from the intergenerational experience of conflict. It can also affect people in terms of diabetes and obesity. Now, when somebody has weight and they're carrying weight, they will be carrying a weight in the areas of unexpressed and undealt with trauma. Many people will carry their weight in the middle belly, the upper belly, and that is where the solar plexus is, and this is where the self-esteem, confidence, and control issues reside. And if there is unresolved trauma in this area, the body will naturally protect itself, and so the body will naturally gain weight in this particular area. And you'll find many people have weight in the upper abdomen, and this is because of unexpressed and undealt with trauma. Also, the solar plexus is related to low self-esteem, low confidence, and digestive disorders can be an effect of the imbalance in the solar plexus area, and also this is where a lot of people will be gaining weight. And once the trauma has been when you become aware and you explore the root cause and you start working through the trauma in terms of therapy, you will find the weight will just drop completely. I had a client that used to come to see me. She was a psychotherapist not long after I started working, way back in 2001. And in psychotherapy, they have a regular meet with their psychotherapists, and they would see patients, clients every week, week in, week out, for years, for months. Now, I would do a very quick, see me for 8 weeks and a follow-up session to close down the treatment. And she wouldn't go, and I couldn't make her leave. And after 6 months, I said, it's time for you to do this on your own. You don't need me anymore. She wouldn't leave. And so she kept on coming to see me for a further 6 months. We did reduce it to once a month. But one of the things I noticed about this particular lady, and she was referring all sorts of people to me that were psychotherapists because of what she had gained from the sessions with me. She lost 3 stone in weight in 6 months. She'd set up a charity, and she'd also gone into a new relationship. She'd moved home. She bought her first new home in a very long time, and she set up a new charity and a new business. And she said, life is good when I'm seeing you. Now, this particular psychotherapist, she was ready. We had gone through and dealt with a lot of what was causing her traumas, and yet she wanted the safety net. She felt it was more comfortable to have the safety net, but her life was different. She was definitely living in a better way and experiencing life for probably the first time in a long time. And she referred many people to me that went through the same kind of transformation. That she was extremely loving of the fact that she didn't tell me very much. But what we did do is we did do a lot of energetic work so that we brought up the trauma in terms of her awareness, so that it would come up into awareness and release without her having to go through the story arising and the expression of the story, the justification and the explanation. And it was much easier for her to deal with the trauma that was releasing, and it changed her life much more for the better. Arthritis is another example of an ailment that people that have associated with intergenerational trauma. And one of the reasons for arthritis is that arthritis is essentially unexpressed anger. Let me say that again. Unexpressed anger. It creates acidity in the body, and you will see many people, especially the silent generation, having hands that are full of arthritis and they can't move them, and feet the same. Now, the hands and feet are related to the root chakra, which is related to where the tail end of the spine meets the genital area. Now, the root chakra is about your foundations, your stability, your very foundational place of home, family, work, relationships, finance, security, money. And when there is an imbalance in the root chakra, it will highlight these kinds of symptoms. And all of these symptoms are related to undealt with trauma in the root chakra, which is where the tail end of the spine meets the genital area. So this can be much more serious than what people think it might be. They think that hiding and not saying and not going through trauma therapy is the answer. It affects you. Whatever you suppress affects you in the body and in the mind. So people that are in constant stress, they produce a high level of the hormone cortisol. And this suppresses the immune system and increases the risk of colds, viral illnesses, and also autoimmune illnesses. Generational trauma affects emotions and relationships. It will affect coping mechanisms such as the use of substance abuse. It also can make people feel that they feel safer isolating by themselves, and it will bring a lack of trust in relationships. So trauma survivors experience a range of intense emotions. They cover things like fear, anxiety, guilt, shame, anger, low self-esteem, low mood, mood swings, temperament. Affecting their sexual life, it also can make them feel numb, and it will also keep them on guard, almost jumpy, and a nervousness in their behavioural experiences. So how do we break the intergenerational trauma? How do we stop the cycle moving from generation to generation to generation? The first step is awareness. It might sound simple, and I've spent a lot of tonight's episode in describing what it is, what it might show up as, physically, emotionally, mentally, how it might show up in your life. Because even though the trauma was many years ago, it still has an impact and it still has an effect. And what happens is that sometimes people will medicate sleep problems, antidepressants, different pills and potions to stop the symptoms. And it's like putting a band-aid onto a wound and not dealing with the underlying root cause of what keeps creating the wound. So the first step is awareness. And in awareness, this is where you can acknowledge the trauma. And this is the first step to recovery, because in a state of awareness, and I say that very heavily, in a state of awareness, you can acknowledge the trauma and move into being healing, in a healing journey of that trauma. To do the healing journey, I would always advise to seek professional support, to seek professional advice. There is many different organisations that will be able to support people going through intergenerational trauma. And it's certainly something that I support a lot of my clients with, intergenerational trauma. Because the thing is that most people won't even realise that they are suffering with intergenerational trauma because it's not as recognised or understood, which is why I've spent a lot of this episode in stating almost to be in awareness. To be in awareness is the first step to healing and moving through your own personal therapy healing journey. To identify the root cause, which is something that I focus on extensively through working with Chakra Psychology. Identifying the root cause, not of something that's just happened or a falling out with somebody that's just happened, that's made things difficult, or something that a new bereavement. It is to identify the root cause of the initial trauma. And then in that root cause of the initial trauma, that depletes all the other traumas that came thereafter. And the next stage is acceptance, accepting that this trauma has happened. Acceptance is part of the therapy healing journey, because many times we don't accept and we push it down because it's too difficult to accept. So we don't. And then we suffer and we pass that on through the generations. To process all the emotions that come up and to grieve. Because trauma is a place where you will need to grieve the loss of the life that you would have had, could have had, but didn't have. The loss of the friendships, the loss of what could have been, if you were more connected. The loss of the relationships within the family, your siblings, and your intimate relationships. And to look at breathing practices and finding more healthy coping mechanisms. I highly recommend breathing practice. That's something that I do with many of my clients. I err on a side of caution here, because breathing practices on your own can be dangerous. So I would always recommend that if you're doing breathing practices, to be facilitated by somebody that can help you, because it can bring up the trauma. And if you're doing them on your own and not sure of what to do, this can be more detrimental. But breathing practice, breathing therapy is so simple and yet really effective for releasing that inner trauma that you may not even have been aware of. Mindfulness practice, being without thought, being intentionally heart focused, and being intentionally out of the mind. I always think that the word mindfulness, when I say that to clients that have not heard the term, sometimes they turn around and say, oh, I don't want my mind full with anything else. I'm fed up. I don't want any more mind. And so what I turn around and say is, no, this is mindlessness. So less mind. Journaling and self-care. Self-care is top of your list. When you look after yourself, then you can move through the intergenerational trauma and you can live in a better way. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for your interest in tonight's topic and tonight's episode. Please do subscribe to USA Global TV and Radio. You will find all of my talking episodes under the playlist Talking Heads and my name, Caroline Heward. I believe that each Talking Heads year is separated, so find my name and Talking Heads and under each year. You can find all of my details in the banner here, and please do reach out if I may be of service to you. You can reach me on No More Stress at live.co.uk, or call if you're international. Use the code +44. If you are local, 07523 120 189. Or connect with me and follow me on my social media platforms, Facebook and LinkedIn. I look forward to being of service to you and helping you through your intergenerational trauma. This is your first step to be in awareness. I look forward to supporting you and helping you with more therapy so that you live in a better way. Namaste.